In this set of videos, I want to talk through some ideas from Rolston's challenging 1975 piece, Is There an Ecological Ethic? This is as important as Routley's 1973 essay. It's one of the first contributions to environmental ethics from a professional philosopher. And Rolston is today thought of, or sometimes called, the founder of environmental ethics as a field in philosophy, partly because of this essay and other work in the 70s and 80s. Of course, we've also read his piece from the early 90s that kind of summarizes some of his ideas. But this 1975 piece provides some of the deeper theoretical underpinning for even some of the things he says in the 1991 piece that we read. A first distinction that Rolston makes is between an ethics that he calls secondarily ecological and an ethics that is primarily ecological. And this is going to be a distinction that probably looks familiar to you because it's similar to some of Leopold's distinctions, like between the A group in conservation and the B group in conservation, or Routley's distinction between a mere continuation of an old ethics or the production of a new ethics that's adequately tailored to environmental concerns. Or like the distinction between anthropocentrism and non-anthropocentrism, as I laid it out in one of the videos and have referred to that distinction ever since. So, but Rolston's articulation of this difference is a little bit different from those others, and he does put it in his own terms, the secondarily ecological and primarily ecological. And this is all happening at a time when the anthropocentric versus non-anthropocentric distinction hadn't really been articulated that clearly yet. And so different authors are kind of struggling with some of the same issues about how to articulate what's missing in the contemporary discussion about ethics, and trying to supply or say what would need to be supplied in order to fill in what's missing. So the basic distinction here, as Rolston describes it, is between an account that treats ecological features merely as a means to achieving values that aren't themselves ecological, values that are, say, anthropocentric values that are coming from somewhere else other than from ecological awareness or ecological concerns themselves. Whereas an ethics that is primarily ecological is going to be one where ecology teaches us new things about what is valuable. It's going to change, as Rolston puts it, our ethical roots. It's going to get down to the kind of core values, or the values that motivate our decision of what is worth doing or not doing. It's going to inform that. It's going to inform what we are trying to do in the most basic and fundamental way, rather than just alter what we take to be the best means to acquire ends that aren't themselves informed by ecology. And another way that Rolston describes this primarily ecological ethics is it will be an ethics where there's a discovery of a moral ought inherent in recognition of the holistic character of an ecosystem. So something about appreciating the holism of an ecosystem. Holism here, or holistic with an H, means basically referring to wholes with a W. It means paying attention to how all of the parts of something fit together, or the way that the complete organization of something or the complete structure of something has a certain character, not just the status of the individual parts. And so the idea here is that when we appreciate ecosystems as wholes, then that is going to teach us something new about what we ought to do. We're going to discover something about what we ought to do, or discover what we ought to do most fundamentally, by appreciating this feature of ecosystems. Now, Rolston recognizes at this point that there's probably some suspicion about what he's proposing, particularly among philosophers, because there's been a tradition in philosophy of distinguishing between factual and evaluative questions. Another way of putting this is a difference between descriptive and evaluative statements or beliefs, or between, it's sometimes called descriptive and normative statements and beliefs. You'll see that word normative show up sometimes. It's to basically mean evaluative, having to do with values. And so this distinction, it's a distinction between claims that say how things are and claims that say how things ought to be. Now, traditionally, science has told us about the way things are. Science aims to describe things better, to explain things better. But science doesn't typically aim to proscribe. It doesn't aim to tell us what we should do. It doesn't aim to answer that question about what we ought to do. It just gives us information, okay? And so there was a famous challenge that was posed for ethical theories. So, I'm sorry, let me finish that comparison. Ethics, traditionally, has been concerned with the question of what we ought to do. Like, think about the ethical theories, the traditional ethical theories we studied, like utilitarianism, Kantianism, virtue ethics. They all gave some instruction about what we ought to do. And so that's very different from science. And philosophers have thought about that difference and articulated that difference for a long time. And there was a famous challenge that was posed in the 1700s by a philosopher named David Hume, which can be expressed this way. How can anyone derive an ought from an is? The challenge here is, how could anyone ever derive an evaluative statement from a mere set of descriptive statements? So I want you to imagine, like, the fullest description of anything that you want. I mean, lots and lots of information about the way that things are. No amount of information about the way that things are will tell you what you ought to do about it, right? That's at least what motivates this idea that we can't derive an ought from an is. So let me give you a simple example. So suppose you see me around Temple campus and I'm smoking a cigarette, and you say, you ought to quit smoking. You shouldn't smoke cigarettes. And I say, why not? And you say, because cigarettes will cut down your life expectancy. If you smoke cigarettes, then you're probably, you could pick up very bad lung problems and throat problems. And the statistics show that people who smoke don't live as long as those who don't. People who smoke don't live as long as those who don't smoke. And you should stop smoking for all those reasons. If I say, I don't care about living long, maybe I'm punk rock, and I want to live fast and die young, and just enjoy life while I'm here, but I don't really care about living a long time. Say I'm planning on dying by the time I'm 45. I don't care about a long life. Then your reasons for why I should quit smoking won't actually convince me. So the problem there is that I agree with all of the descriptive statements you've made. I agree with, yes, I recognize that smoking can often lead to lung cancer. I recognize that life expectancy goes down if people smoke, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if I don't agree to some evaluative statement, like I should try to live the longest life that I can, then no amount of descriptive statements will ever be able to prove or to convince me, or no amount of descriptive statements will ever be able to provide sufficient evidence for a statement about what I ought to do. And traditionally, the way that this is understood is that we can derive ought statements from a set of descriptive statements, but we need to include or tack on to those descriptive statements at least one ought statement as well. So for instance, if I agree with you that smoking leads to lower life expectancy, and I also agree with you that we ought to try to live as long as we can, or that I ought to try to live as long as I can, then I can derive the conclusion that I ought to quit smoking. But if I hadn't adopted that ought statement, then the ought statement about I ought to live as long a life as I can, then I actually don't yet have enough reason, based on the descriptive statements, to conclude that I ought to quit smoking. So that's the point about the challenge of moving from a descriptive science, such as ecology, to a normative claim, such as that we ought to protect ecosystems. And this is what Rolston wants to try to bridge the gap with. So it's kind of surprising. It goes against like everything that I've given you so far about the deriving an ought from an is problem. That's the traditional philosophical way of thinking about it. But Rolston says there is a sense in which we can expect to learn something from science about what is valuable. So if we study ecology, ecology could actually, even though it's just a set of descriptions and explanations, it's self-normative. What happens, he thinks, is when we study ecology, we start to recognize sources of value, things that are valuable that we didn't recognize before. It's like we're noticing or learning about what's valuable. At the same time, we're noticing and learning things about the way that the world works. Now, notice that this has to be the case, or it has to be possible for this to be the case, in order for something like what Rolston calls a primarily ecological ethics to be understandable. It has to be possible that ecology can teach us new things about what is valuable, or else we will never be able to get this primarily ecological ethics. And this, I think, is really the deep, if not the deepest, certainly one of the deepest things, the deepest ideas presented in this 1975 piece, and maybe in Rolston's entire career. It's the idea that when we appreciate ecosystems and study ecosystems, even just from a scientific standpoint, that can start to fundamentally change our value systems. And it gives us a glimpse or a way forward to develop a fully primarily ecological ethics that is well motivated. It's based on reasons. We can explain why we value what we do by appeal to the science, even if we can't fully deduce it from the science or derive it from the science in a scientific way. We can still explain through reference to the science why we value what we value. And what we value will be really fundamentally different than what it was before we studied ecology. And so now Rolston, there are a couple of passages from this essay which I want to highlight for you in how, because of how Rolston describes this transformation that he thinks can and should happen here.